Okay, we'll get rolling now. So no, thank you guys for coming out tonight. I know there's a lot of things to do, especially this time of the year, so it means a lot that you chose to take some time to join us. I hope the food was at least worth it, if nothing else that happens tonight. And I want to thank Southern FS for putting this on. They're one of a handful of dealers that put this effort out. For those of you that don't know me, my name is David Williams. I'm a native of Cobden, Illinois, fourth generation out there, and grew up on a cattle farm. We had a few horses around, didn't do a whole lot with them. My dad got me involved with a gentleman named Mark Schwarm when I was about 8 years old. He used to be around these parts, and he kind of taught me how to sit on one without falling off. And most of my experience comes from the military. I got out to Fort Riley, Kansas about 4 years into a 6-year tour in the infantry, which the infantry isn't a lot of fun, and saw these guys riding horses on base. So went and tried out with them. They were one of 3 units that still remains today that are true horse-mounted cavalry, do mainly demonstrations, and also we did train units going to Afghanistan how to pack mules to carry mortars and equipment up into the mountains. So I got to go around the country doing a cavalry tactics demonstration. I've got some crooked teeth from that if anyone wants to look at them later, but that was a lot of fun. And then got out of that in 2012, went to SIU and did a bachelor's and master's in animal nutrition, and got picked up from Purina a little bit after that. I've been with Purina almost 7 years now, working in the Great Lakes region. So it's my wife Charity, my daughters Lily and Cora, and then we got a son coming in February, so things are filling up quick at the Williams house. But what's new with us? Only just a couple things since the last time we talked. Ration balancers are one of the fastest growing segments of the horse feed industry, believe it or not. As people get better at producing hay, ration balancers make more sense to make up some of that difference. So a senior ration balancer is something a lot of you have asked us for over the years. So we have formulated a ration balancer specifically for senior horses. We call it Enriched Senior. The differences that we're going to see with that are really the addition of our ActiveAge prebiotic, which is specifically targeted to help with joint health and immune system response. That's the same thing you'll see inside our Equine Senior. We've really only seen a benefit of prebiotics in senior horses, so that's why we only really include them in those few products. It does have our Outlast gastric support built in as well, and it can be soaked, just like your regular Equine Senior. So if you have a senior horse, you're able to keep condition on them with your forage, and you're wanting to balance the protein, vitamins, and minerals, this gives you the ability to do that with about a 1 to 1 1/4 pound fed rate. And that really joins just our complete list of ration balancers: regular Enrich, which most of you are familiar with, Enrich Plus, and then Omega Match, which is kind of designed to mimic a grass pasture diet on horses that are in stalls and keep that omega-3 balance in check. And then another thing we've been asked for probably more years than that is a mash. And we were kind of like, well, why? What's the point of making a mash? That's just kind of anything could be turned into a mash. But we did it mainly because we had such an overwhelming amount of people requesting that we do it. But we kind of combined an electrolyte supplement with Outlast gastric support in a mash that's nutritionally balanced. Places where this makes sense is if we're needing to encourage a horse to eat or drink, you soak this. It'll soak in a tremendous amount of water and kind of force hydrate horses. A lot of feedback I've had is folks that are traveling and they've got a short time at a truck stop to stop and water their horses. They don't always want to drink. This is a way to kind of insist that they get some water in them. It gives the amount of electrolytes that a horse will expend in about 30 minutes of hard sweating. So we can replenish electrolytes after exercise and recovery. And then also for anything else you would use a mash for is something to help them take in medicine or after they've had a veterinary event where they have to be on a mash for whatever reason. So that is also available as well. So now to our main topic for tonight. We put together a slide deck really talking about myth busters. As I'm out and about making recommendations, I come across a lot of things and kind of the same things over and over again that, you know, maybe we did believe at one point in time. We did think those things were true, but with research we've seen that it's not exactly the way we thought it was. So I've kind of put together a slide deck of those most common things we run into. Now I'm going to be honest and open for a second. I have found that the opinions of horse people are near and dear to their heart. So if I say something up here that you are very frustrated about, or that in some way affects your well-being as a human, please just come see me afterwards. All of these things can be traced back to university level research. We'll talk about it. And if you don't want to agree with me, I promise you don't have to. I'm a Baptist pastor. Lots of people think I'm weird. So you can think I'm weird too. It's fine. But I'm going to present this to you, and hopefully it's entertaining, if nothing else. So these myths come from a lot of different sources. Just tradition. I mean, there's stuff we've believed for a lot of years. There's some weird stuff out there. I mean, there's some sort of pregnancy test where you have a woman urinate on a mash of barley and see what grows in it. I don't think most of us are doing that at this point. We're going to the doctor. Word of mouth. We hear things. We hear rumors. Dr. Google is the #1 source of most of these things. Google's great, but just know if that source doesn't end in .edu, you probably need to question it a little bit. Anything that ends in .com, we typically try and stay away from. And then other species. There's a tremendous amount of research done in humans, done in mice. None of those things are hindgut fermenters like horses. So some of the research done in those species doesn't necessarily translate over to horses. So that's where a lot of these things stem from, and we're going to walk through a few of them. I'll try to stop walking in front of that. So we're going to start off with an easy one. Trace mineral blocks will meet mineral requirements of horses. And it's simply not true in an amount that they will consume easily. When we look at the breakdown of a trace mineral block, when it says trace mineral, it means just that, a trace of mineral. They'd have to eat about 1.5 pounds a day of that block to start to approach their requirements. They could lick on that thing until their tongue fell off, and they're probably not going to get 1.5 pounds. If you look at a vitamin and mineral pack that's designed specifically for horses, you're going to find that most of those, whether it's ours or one of our competitors, is going to do that in 2 to 4 ounces. So it's got a lot more packed into a smaller amount designed to be usable for the animal if we're making up that difference. And if you've got really good quality pasture and you're not asking a tremendous amount out of your horse, there are times, especially when we have nice, flush, mineral-rich grass, vitamin-rich grass, I have seen that be the only thing that animal needs. Once again, depending on how much you're asking it to do. So how about a salt block at least provides all of the salt my horse needs? That kind of seems like a no-brainer. Well, this study took 10 horses and kind of looked at how much salt they would take off of a block over the course of 14 days and averaged it out. And only 2 of them really got to that level. It wasn't that the salt wasn't there for them, just the amount they licked on their own got to that 15 milligram level that we are looking at for a horse that's in a moderate amount of work. If they were in less work, they wouldn't need as much of it. So if we're counting on them to do it on their own, they aren't always. And this isn't the end of the world, but it's something that's kind of interesting to look at. If you're looking at an electrolyte supplement, based off of what we just saw, what do you think the most important thing to be in that supplement is? Salt. So watch the labels on electrolyte supplements, because a lot of them are going to have light salt and a higher level of sugar and potassium. So we want to see that salt be the first ingredient in most of those electrolyte supplements if we're in a situation where we're needing to feed that. So this is one. Extruded feeds are kind of a hot button right now. So I get asked a lot, does the extrusion process improve the digestibility of a horse feed? And the answer is it depends. You ever notice every time you ask somebody that's an expert in the field, they answer with "it depends" constantly? It's pretty annoying, isn't it? Yeah. It depends. Extrusion does improve starch digestion. That's absolutely true. The other thing extrusion does, and the reason it became popular, is we can put a higher amount of fat in an extruded feed. We get much over 10% fat in a pellet. It becomes really hard to get that pellet to hold together for a long period of time, but the extrusion process fixes that. That's why our Amplify fat supplement, that's about 30% fat, it's extruded. That's the only way we can get that much fat in it. But your digestibility of your fibers actually is harmed by that extrusion process, and sometimes we're counting on a significant amount of our nutrition to come from that. This is something we did at our farm. We looked at Equine Senior and then took this diet and ran it through either a pelleting process or an extrusion process. And this is just showing you that the intake and the digestibility of what was intaked both went down when we ran it through that extrusion process based on that fiber digestibility. So keep that in mind. It does improve some things, but it does harm other things. In the end, it's not a huge benefit either way. We're talking very, very minuscule benefit. You can feed straight alfalfa hay to horses. Most of you guys know, of course, you can do that. But what I would challenge you is, does your horse need straight alfalfa hay, and does it need as much straight alfalfa hay as you're giving to it? I've got a couple stables I really hate to visit in winter because everything's locked up and they're feeding straight alfalfa and there's not much airflow and you can't hardly breathe when you walk into those places because of the ammonia smell. Well, the reason that ammonia smell is there is because there's excess protein in the horse's diet that it's excreting in its urine. And chances are you're spending money on this alfalfa hay you don't need to spend. You're giving them way more than what they need. So that's where I can help you balance that out. If that's something that you're curious about, you can tell a lot just based by that urine smell, though, if we're getting that really high, hot ammonia smell. So you're really not harming a healthy horse. If your horse has kidney issues, if your horse has liver issues, that excessive protein can start to be a problem pretty quick. The excessive potassium can be an issue, but on a healthy horse, that extra protein really isn't going to hurt them, but it is hurting your pocketbook. There's a lot of great things about alfalfa. As you guys know, horses like to eat it. It's more digestible if it's cut at the right time than other forages. This gastric buffer piece is huge. Alfalfa actually, when we tested gastric buffering supplements against our Outlast, alfalfa got second place. It beat every other buffering agent in the market. It only lasts about 30 minutes, though, before it moves through the system. So that's where something like Outlast that runs for about 4 hours, and a laxative effect. Story for you guys, about 2 hours east of here, I got called out. Lady had bought a horse that was skin and bones and was trying to put weight on it, couldn't get it to gain weight, and it had diarrhea. So when I went and visited the horse, and there was diarrhea all over the walls, I asked what it was being fed. It was being given 20 pounds of alfalfa a day and 18 pounds of Calm Ultra. Yeah. So that laxative effect can really get kicked into overdrive if you want to. So quality of hay in the end, that's more important than the variety of hay. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to test someone's hay and they said, this is good alfalfa. What I'm looking at when I test your hay is digestible calories, digestible energy, and protein. Those are the two biggest things I'm looking at in that hay. And I've had some of that good alfalfa come back pretty rough because there was a lot in there that wasn't alfalfa. So this is kind of where I give my plug for getting your hay tested. If you've got a lot of horses and you get a significant amount of hay from one source, it's only about $24 to send that off and see what that hay looks like. And if we do that in the fall when we're about to start feeding it, it can prevent us from getting into a situation where we have weight we need to put back on horses. Because I'll give you a secret that feed companies like to keep near and dear to their heart. You have to feed them twice as much to put the weight back on as you do to keep the weight on them if it's already there. So, too much protein causes OCD in growing horses. And there's probably a lot of you in this room that would say this is true. I would have considered this true for a long time just off of stuff that my grandpa told me. But what we know now is that is false. Protein is not the issue in these horses. What we run into is we've got a balancing act to do. We have to balance their genetics with their nutrition, with their environment. And if we keep those things balanced well, that's how we prevent things like this. The number one cause of that issue is having feeds that are too high in energy, that aren't balanced with the protein and vitamins and minerals in the feed. And if you look at the Purina lineup, I'll talk about that because I know it better than the others. We've really got 3 feeds designed to grow a foal, and they're all going to grow that foal at a different rate. Ultium growth is the fastest we would recommend that you grow a foal, and we x-ray those foals every week for their first 2 years of life when we developed that feed to make sure that we were giving them what they needed to grow at that rate without running into issues. We can get a foal to grow just as fast on a corn meal mix mixture as we can something like Ultium growth. The difference is going to be how they sustain that growth and how their body is able to handle that growth. So those are things we have to keep in mind and remember. It's all a balancing act. Soybeans are known to affect hormones and reproduction in horses. That's kind of a newer thing I'm hearing more and more about. The truth is there's absolutely no research that backs this up in horses. There is some research that backs this up in humans. I mean, we know soybeans contain phytoestrogens. You don't want to know how much of that is in an Impossible Whopper. If you're eating an Impossible Whopper because people implant beef cattle and you're worried about hormones, I promise you're making the wrong decision. There's about 30 times more in that Impossible Whopper But humans, typically, we have had issues with humans over-consuming soy and over-supplementing soy, and in human females, that has shown to cause an issue when we get to extremely high levels. But we just haven't seen that in horses. This is a research article that we contributed to along with Penn State, the University of Florida, and the University of Central Florida. This isn't University of Phoenix. These are reputable universities. And there was absolutely no correlation found between the amount of estrogen you would consume in any commercial horse feed, or soy in any commercial horse feed, and any impact on those issues. So there are several benefits. Soybeans meal has one of the highest amino acid profiles that is directly correlated to what your horse needs in amino acids of any feedstuff. And when I say amino acid balance, amino acids make proteins. And so every protein is made up of a balance of amino acids. And every animal has what we call a limiting amino acid. In horses, it happens to be lysine. You can give them all the protein in the world, they will only digest the amount of protein they have lysine to digest. It's easy to talk about when it comes to human protein supplements, because you can go to a GNC or one of those stores and you can find a $15 bucket of protein powder and you can find a $60 bucket of protein powder. The difference you're going to see in that is often that amino acid makeup. One is much more usable than the other. That's why to me as a nutritionist, that crude protein that's on the feed tag, it means almost nothing to me. I can find 14% feeds that feed better than 16% feeds based on that quality of protein. And soybean meal is one of the best. Well, that's one thing to keep in mind. As far as allergies go, there are soy allergies. They are pretty rare. And one thing it's on here somewhere because I put it on there somewhere. The blood serum tests are not the way to find your soy allergies, so we'll talk about that a little bit. But an elimination diet is the number one way that we're going to try and figure out if that is an issue. And at that point, you're going to work with a nutritionist to figure out what your feeding program needs to look like, but those are pretty rare. So. I love this one. Sweet feed makes my horse crazy and causes insulin resistance, colic, tying up, and global warming. And what I found as I'm out consulting is you either love sweet feed and hate pellets, or you kind of love pellets and hate sweet feed. There's a few people that are indifferent, but most folks are kind of strong one way or the other on those things, and that's fine. Every company makes both. This is false. Nutrition and behavior is not an exact science. It's not. You do have horses that are going to be hotter when you feed them a higher energy diet. And there's an old salesman I learned from, and he said when you take a butt head and give them more energy, you've just made them able to act more like a butt head. Was kind of the way he put it. It's kind of a humorous way to think of it. But excess calories can make a horse more energetic, and for horses that are already on the hot side, a higher fat and fiber source of energy might be beneficial for those horses. But like I said, not an exact science, and some horses handle it just fine. Where I see this issue come into play often is when I've made a recommendation to somebody that wants to gain weight with their horse, so I put them on a higher calorie feed to make that happen. Well, they get on the horse the next day and there's some more pep in their step. Well, if you get a brand new car and it's got 600 horsepower, that first week you drive it, you're probably going to be pushing that pedal down to the floor because you kind of like the way that feels. But after a couple months, if you got any sense, you're going to get kind of normal with the way you handle it. These guys are often the same way. When we increase that energy, because we're trying to accomplish a goal, those first few days, a lot of times they can have that pep in their step, but everything lines out given enough time. So, when it comes to starch and sugar, they are incredibly important. They have their functions in nutrition. When you exercise to the point that you're in an anaerobic state, so you've ran out of oxygen, you're no longer able to really break down fat to get the energy you need. That starch and sugar is what you're existing off of. So we think of sprinting type exercises. Starch and sugar is very important for brain and hoof development and important fuel for the liver as well. So there's a place for starch and sugar. It's not the devil. A safe level we would consider to be 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per meal. There's 454 grams in a pound. That's quite a bit of starch and sugar that animal can consume before we start to have issues as long as they're healthy. Where we see a lot of the issues with starch and sugar happens to be when we're feeding horses starch and sugar and then giving them nothing to do with that starch and sugar over long periods of time. When we have sedentary horses or overweight horses, even on a very small amount of grain and concentrate, we can run into those issues, just like we do with a human being that sits at home on the couch and never exercises and eats that kind of diet. So that would be an example of that right there. In the end, on our product line, we've got the whole gambit of levels of starch and sugar to meet just about any situation. Protein makes my horse hot. False, but there's a reason you think that, and it makes sense. Energy comes from calories. If we have excessive protein, that protein gets broken down. That costs energy to break that protein down. Very, very inefficient process for the horse to get energy from protein. Energy comes from calories. But since we have to, if you paid attention to the slides earlier, balance the amount of protein with the amount of energy in a horse feed, as the amount of protein goes up, the amount of energy typically goes up. So a 14% horse feed should have more energy than a 12%. A 16% horse feed should have more energy than both of those. But I can balance all of that, because when I'm making a ration for your horse, I don't care anything about percents. Your horse eats an amount of pounds of protein a day. If you're giving your horse 5 pounds of feed and it's 10% protein, I'm just doing that because I went to SIU and my math isn't that good, 0.10 times 5, you're giving your horse about a half pound of protein a day. And that's what I'm worried about from a nutritional perspective, is the weight of protein, the weight of energy you're giving that horse. Which means if I'm going to switch you from that 12% to that 16%, and your horse is doing fine, I'm going to have you feeding less of that. And the amount of protein and the amount of energy are going to end up being the same on a lower feeding rate. So one thing to keep in mind. Protein deficient diets can make horses quieter. That's because they're eating themselves. If you're in a protein deficient diet, your horse is consuming its own muscle to get the energy it's not getting from its diet. That's why that top line starts to go away. It's the first thing that horse starts to break down for energy if you're in a limited energy diet. Protein optimal diets will make horses feel their best. So if you move a horse from a protein deficient to a protein optimal diet, once again, that first little bit of time, you're going to see them have some pep. Protein excessive diets, it's just going to be excreted. There's that ammonia smell again. In the end, like I said, we're trying to hit a certain amount of protein. So a pound of enriched balancer, that's 145 grams of protein. 3 pounds of Omaline 100, 136 grams of protein. It's that gram weight, that pound weight that we're really trying to target. Protein is critical. Muscle development, immune system function, hair and hoof quality. Once again, that amino acid balance is incredibly important. I need added protein to build muscle. That's absolutely true. That amino acid profile matters, as we discussed, and the amount matters. Horses are big animals. It can take a little bit of protein to put muscle back on that animal. Now, adding energy might help them get back in condition, but it's not going to add muscle. We can only get muscle from protein. We'll talk about that more here in just a little bit. Beet pulp is high in calories. I run across a lot of folks trying to add weight with beet pulp. This is kind of relative. Beet pulp is higher in calories than most hay, but it's lower in calories than most feed. So it can take quite a bit of it to really put weight back on an animal. It does have a fill effect, and that's sometimes what we see more than anything from it. It's heavily used in the show feed world because of that. High-fat diets are unnatural for horses. That's true, but once again, relative. Most of your natural forages are 2 to 3% fat on a dry matter basis. So if we're after something fat and shiny and we're after calories, well, there's a difference in that. 20 pounds of forage at 2%, that's 0.4 pounds of fat. 6 pounds at 6%, that would be a feed, that's 0.36 pounds of fat. Oil, I run across a lot when someone's showing me what they feed where they put just this sprinkle of oil in their feed. And if you're doing like an omega-3, omega-6 supplement, that could be a meaningful amount depending on what it is, if it was ahi flower oil. But if we're trying to add weight to a horse by giving them oil, it takes somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000 calories to put a pound on a horse, depending on how efficient they are. 2 cups, 8-ounce cups of oil is 4,000 calories. So we're going to be adding a lot of oil to horse feed to make any meaningful difference in how much weight they're actually gaining. And it can get pretty messy when you get to those amounts. So just something to keep in mind. Oil is 100% fat, but there's still a certain amount of it takes to do anything. If you need fat and shiny, there's ways to do that. Oil is one of them. But I want to talk about this horse here for a second. You know, that's quite a big difference, not just in body condition of the horse, but muscle structure, coat health, everything. You know, protein is not going to get this horse to look like that by itself. They're going to take that protein, they're going to use it for the energy they're not getting to maintain condition, and you're going to spend a tremendous amount of money feeding expensive protein to a horse for calories. If you just gave this horse something like amplify or increase the feeding rate, you're going to get body condition back, but you're not going to get that top line back because you're going to give them the calories they need to maintain condition, but not the protein they need to build muscle. Back to that balance. They have to have the energy they need to maintain condition, the energy they need to make muscle, and the protein that energy will allow them to take to use to make that muscle. So you can't accomplish everything with one silver bullet. I wish you could. Fat and shiny equals healthy. I wish that were true. False. So I can eat Lay's potato chips all day and I can be pretty fat and I can be pretty shiny. But in the end, there's an appropriate body condition for my height and my age and my activity level. And same thing for your horse. There's a body condition that's appropriate for them based on the way God made them. Hoof growth, muscle tone, stamina, immune system function, all of these things can start to take a hit if body condition score is too low. All of them start to take a hit again if body condition score is too high. So we start to run into the same conditions with an obese horse that we can run into with a horse that's underconditioned. So thin horses, they're at a significant disadvantage athletically because when we get below a 4.5 body condition score, we know that body is actively consuming muscle mass for energy. That means we're going to hit fatigue faster. Horses that are fatigued are more prone to injury. Once again, fat will not replace muscle mass. Protein will not replace fat. It's about that balance and getting that calorie load right when other things are lacking. And this is a time of year to pay attention to that. This next 2 months, every year, I'll get between 6 and 20 phone calls. What did you change in the Purina feed? My horse is losing condition. And what it is we've started feeding our forages. We're off pasture. It's dried up. And we're starting to see the effects of either having a good or a bad forage. Oftentimes, we have to make an adjustment to our feeding rate as we move into using our stored forages. So that's something we got to pay attention to. I need a high-fat feed. Maybe it's calories. We need calories. We look at Strategy, one of our older horse feeds, 6% fat, 1,500 kcals per pound. We released Strategy Healthy Edge and immediately confused a bunch of you right off the bat because you saw that wrong button. You saw that Strategy Healthy Edge was 8% fat and thought it was a hotter feed than Strategy. Well, it's not. Strategy is 1,500 calories per pound. Strategy Healthy Edge is 1,300 calories per pound. It's 200 less calories. There is more fat, but you have to remember, just because something is a certain percentage fat, if you've got a 10% fat horse feed, it's 90% something else. Strategy Healthy Edge was designed to have more friendly, digestible nutrients. You could kind of almost think of it as a Strategy Senior, higher fiber, higher fat, and just an easier feed for those horses that had trouble digesting a normal feed. The intention was never to make a feed that had more energy in it, but that fat level confused a lot of folks. I recently tested a 10% fat feed for a gal over in Anna, and it came back at 1,440 calories at 10% fat. So the percent fat tells you the percent fat. It really doesn't give you the overall energy level of the feed. So just something to keep in mind. Looking at tags in general, and that's a part of it, this is something that Karen Davison, she's one of our senior nutritionists, gal from Texas, has the accent, says bless your heart. You can tell which way she means it, kind of based on the accent she uses with it. But she put together this tag for a Western saddle. They're both for use on horses participating in events requiring a saddle with a horn. 16-inch minimum size, 1 horn minimum, 2 stirrups minimum, 1 cinch max, or 1 cinch minimum, 2 cinch max. Same ingredients, leather, steel, wood, and rawhide. You can get one for $329 or one for $3,500, identical tags. We've got the Rambler for $329 and Bob's Custom Saddle for $3,500. Now, there's some people that the Rambler makes sense for. I mean, if you've got a horse in your backyard that you tie to your clothesline and you're going to get on them once every couple months to take a picture for Facebook, that Rambler probably makes sense. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. We know you love your horses. If you're on them every day and you like having hair, I'm going to stop there. Bob's Custom Saddle would probably be a better thought process for you. So everything's relative. Supplements built in the feed is a great idea sometimes. Beware of tag dressing, because what we're worried about is a meaningful level of something versus enough to get it on the tag and make the list. So this is one I ran into on biotin. I was asked a question about biotin by one of our vet techs that's here tonight. This lady, you'd know the barn if I told it to you. It's across the river. She was about to quit me because I didn't have biotin on my tag for my horse feed. There's biotin in every horse feed, just there's not a meaningful level in most horse feeds, so we don't put it on the tag, but this company did. So we discovered as we did some math that to get a meaningful level of biotin, she would have to feed 46 pounds a day of this horse feed to get a meaningful level. So that's an example of tag dressing, just making sure that there's enough in there to actually do something. My horse is fine on just hay and a vitamin mineral supplement. True. Anybody shocked by that answer? True for that horse, the one tied to the clothesline in your backyard. Not so true for these types of animals. So once again, this is where it comes down to understanding what your horse does. We have some tools to help with that, some calculators that we can start to throw information into and get an idea of their requirements. In the end, it's you watching them that is really going to make sure we get that right. I tell people, take pictures of your horses every 30 days. You get barn blind when you see them every day, but you can see a 30-day difference. And when you start to see that decline in body condition score on that 30-day check-in, let's make an adjustment, because we use our horses different at different times of the year. And once again, the thing we want to avoid is having to put weight back on a horse. That's incredibly expensive to do. This is a horse at 1,200 pounds, moderate work. They were given it 24 pounds a day of Stanley Timothy. And this line represents its requirements at that level of work. And these bars represent how close we got to meeting that requirement on these different things. So we were short on energy, we're short on most vitamins and minerals. So then we start adding something like Platinum Wellness at 214 a day. It gets us up there on a whole bunch of them. We're still shy on some. A California Trace Plus, these are just different vitamin mineral packs. You can see we get there with a few of them, but just not quite all the way up there. Enrich Plus, it's amazing how it hits every single one of those levels, almost like it was balanced to balance a ration. That's why we call it a ration balancer of a forage diet. So it was formulated to do exactly that. We should feed horses more like Mother Nature. I've ran into this one a few times. That's false unless you want your horse to perform like Mother Nature's horses performs. And what that looks like in our Mustang herds is a horse that matures at about 6 years old at somewhere around 700 pounds and lives to about 14. Those are average numbers. So if that's what you want out of your horse, then you can treat them exactly like Mother Nature treats them. If we're wanting more performance out of them, we have to feed them for the performance. It all comes down to forage quality and demands on the horse. There's times where we can come darn near to supporting every need of a horse in light work on pasture alone, when our pasture looks like that in the best times of the year. That's a different situation. That's very much a different situation, and we have to take all of that into account. All right, we're almost done. My horse with Cushing's disease needs less than 12% NSC in their feed. False unless they're actually insulin resistant on top of that. Keep in mind, but I tell people, we still have to feed these horses. We still have to feed them enough to keep in condition. We can reduce the starch to sugar. That target's not well established, but we know that 20 to 24% non-structural carbohydrates appears to be a good upper limit for these horses. Most of you would probably consider that pretty high, but we can go up to that level in the majority of these animals, except for the ones that get pretty high up there on their insulin response. So, looking at that total balance of nutrients. I run across often people that are starving their horses that have Cushing's because they're so afraid of the starch and sugar that they're limiting their diet down too much. We don't want to starve those horses. We've got ways to make it happen and get them to look like this instead of that. So, high-fat feeds for a skinny senior. My clicker is really overzealous. Okay. Good night. Sorry, guys. So false more often than we think. We need to understand why that senior horse is thin. And what we run across more times than not is something has changed and they're not able to extract the calories from forage as well as they used to. And a lot of times that's due to these teeth not chewing that forage enough to get good surface contact inside the stomach. So we do look at things like forage replacement, helping them get those calories extracted from that forage. Sometimes they just need more calories because they're at that stage in life, and that's when we're going to start evaluating different feeds that we can use to increase that calorie load for that animal. Lowest NSC tag for carb-sensitive horses. This is just an example I wanted to show you guys. This horse was on Strategy GX. It was taking about 5 pounds a day to keep him in shape. At the levels of starch and sugar in Strategy, that 5 pounds equals 1.25 pounds of starch and sugar that horse was consuming. That was too much for him. We needed to reduce the starch and sugar that horse was consuming. A lot of folks go straight to well-solved low starch, honestly because it says low starch, and it seems like the best option. But there's only 1,200 calories in a pound of well-solve. So to get to that 7,500 calories at 11%, that horse ends up eating about 0.69 pounds of non-structural carbohydrates. Well, with Ultium Competition, it's much higher in NSC, but also much higher in calories. We can hit that calorie requirement with much less feed and a lower overall feeding cost with the same amount of non-structural carbohydrates. Let me do that math for you. I'm happy to do that math for you, but let's just make sure we're feeding them the best thing for what you're dealing with. Okay. And this is my last one actually, so thank you guys for bearing with me. Serum allergy tests can tell you what foods to avoid. I'm just going to walk you through a little experiment we did at our farm, and you can tell me what you think. Once again, we would say false. We would say an elimination diet is the gold standard. There are a few other things that work, but here's what we did. We took samples from 2 horses, a Bay Cruiser and Trixie, down at our research farm in Gray Summit, and sent them to 2 different companies to be tested. And we only saw a 61% agreement between the companies. They found the horses, the 2 companies found both horses to be allergic to different things. One allergic to 21 out of 56 and 18 out of 56, and Company A found them to be allergic to 27 out of 89 and 24 out of 89. So that's not good agreement, but the little trick we did was this was actually the same horse. We took blood from the same horse and put it in 2 different vials, gave it 2 different names and sent it to these companies, and saw these differences in response on that blood serum test. So our confidence in that process is not overly high. I'm not going to say it can't be used to steer you in the right direction of some things to maybe look at, but an elimination diet is the only way we're really going to know 100% for sure. So there's Dottie. That's the horse, in case you were curious. She's still down there today. But products with more ingredients are better, more bang for your buck. This is going to be false oftentimes because, once again, we get back to that meaningful level. You'll see this label on a lot of our feeds, and this is kind of how we think about this. When we have an additive in a feed, there needs to be research done in horses that backs that up. It needs to have the same ingredients that research was done on. You'll find that's not always the case. The delivered amount needs to be the amount that the research says works. This used to say dose, and someone threatened to sue us because they said the word dose correlates that we're meaning it's a therapeutic amount, so we had to change that word. And then efficacy. Do you see a difference in your animal when you use this product? Does it do what it says it's going to do for you? This is a product that I snapped a tag on. The dose is 2 scoops a day, or 2 to 6 scoops a day for recovery. It's a 50-gram scoop. You start going down, it's got velvet antler in it. I'm not too big on Chinese medicine. I don't know what velvet antler does. Don't Google it. It's got melatonin in it, dewormer, You guys know what a dose of dewormer, how much you have to give. If it's this far down on a 50-gram supplement, I don't know if it's doing much for you. What's this one? Hoshou Wu root. So whatever Hoshou Wu root does, I also wouldn't recommend Googling that. So we would say that this fails the test drive based on those things. There has to be the amount needed in the supplement that adds up to be the right amount and the amount that you feed that equals the amount needed for your horse. Efficacy, if you fed that horse a supplement that said it was going to shrink their ears, its ears need to be shorter 4 weeks later than what they were the day you started. So measure the ears and see if it works. Probiotics improve digestion and health. Maybe, maybe not. We're about to change the world a little bit this spring. I can't talk much about it, but we've been researching this hot and heavy for about 6 years now, taking fecal swabs from horses all over the country. We had every state but Hawaii, and a girl that works for me went on vacation and took a fecal swab kit with her to Hawaii, so we added a fecal swab from Hawaii. Because here's the thing, guys, we know what less than 10% of the bacteria that exists in the hindgut are. We've identified less than 10% of them, and we don't know what the right ones to be there necessarily are for a horse, and we don't know if the right ones for a horse here or the right ones for a horse in Arizona or the right ones for a horse in Florida, because that's what we saw at our research farm when we started testing probiotic packs, is they would help some horses, do nothing for some horses, and sometimes hinder a horse, or at least so it seemed. And we really think that comes down to what that population looks like. So we've taken, I think, over 100,000 of these swabs and sequenced them at this point. And what we can tell you is a lot of the supplements you see out there, let's just compare it to the human dose. Most of these probiotic supplements, you need 10 to 15 billion CFU a day for humans, if you look at a human supplement. Which if you take the size of a horse compared to the size of a human, we'd say they needed 50 to 300 billion. And you start looking at the total count in some of these supplements, and the dose is 40.8 million. So it's dramatically less than the dose in a human supplement. So there's a lot out there. The marketing has definitely outpaced the research when it comes to probiotics. But we're working on it, and that's the Equine Microbiome Project. We need your help on this. As we've sequenced these horses, we found that the vast majority of these healthier horses, which are 3, body condition score 3, I wouldn't necessarily call it healthy, most of you wouldn't either, but it's where we see the change. We see a similarity. These colors are the populations of different bacteria in those animals. We have a tremendous amount of samples from horses in that body condition score 3 to 8 that we would say don't have any disease or anything wrong with them. We really need samples from unhealthy horses. If you have a problem child, we would like a sample from your problem child. And see me afterwards. I can tell you how to get one of these kits. It's absolutely free, and we'll get you an Outlaws coupon for your trouble. Where this is going is a probiotic supplement that's actually geared to address the real population inside horses in your geographical area. And then a time where you can swab your horse, send it to us, and we'll be able to tell you what feed would be best to feed that specific horse based on this data, and also give you early warning for potential health issues with that horse. So that's what's coming in the future. So that's that kit. Once again, see me and I'll show you how to get that ordered. So last slides, all commercial horse feeds are pretty much the same. That's our research farm. I'm awful proud of that. These pictures over here are the biggest reasons they're not. You see that glow on that corn? That's aflatoxin, mycotoxins. We test every load of corn that comes in for that. If a load of corn tests hot for that, you don't have to reject it. You can dilute it, and it's perfectly legal, and you can send it out the door once you get it to the acceptable level. We don't. We reject that whole load of corn, and it goes somewhere. That's rumensin. More specifically, that's a pellet of horse feed and the amount of rumensin it takes to kill a full-grown horse. You can make horse feed in plants that contain rumensin. There's nothing that says you can't. We don't. We have a specific plant that we make our horse feed in that does not allow rumensin through the doors. So that's some of the things we do differently, and we're proud of it. So in the end, that is a fat pony. I used to work as a horseshoer. I hate ponies. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you guys for bearing with me. Thank you. I will be over here for the rest of the night for any questions you might ask. And if you are tech savvy, I have a way for you to get a $15 coupon by scanning that QR code. If you're not tech savvy, take a picture of it and take it to someone who is, and they'll get it for you. But you got to do a survey, and it'll email you the coupon to print out. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Beasley.
Okay. Thank you, FS and Purina, for putting this on. One more round of applause for them. Anybody here for the free meal? Just for the free meal? How about the 1 ton of Purina feed? You got to suffer through my lecture first. We'll try to keep it quick, though. So we're going to talk about Equine Gastric Ulcer Syndrome tonight, and kind of how to help your horse feel the best so he can give you his best. We're going to start with a little story about a horse named Houston. Houston was a little cutting horse, really nice bred horse, had a nice farm, and the owner hired a young girl to take care of him, halter break him, mess with him every day, and just make him a good horse, and he was. And the owner also had a 4-year-old grandson that would come out, pick up every foot, clean him out, and Houston loved to be brushed. The girl left for a week. She came back, and Houston was a jerk. Houston was also a stud colt, so you know what happens about that 7-month-old age. They find out what those 2 things between their legs are for. He wouldn't tie. You couldn't pick up his feet, and he tried to bite you when you brushed him. So what do you think happened when they sent Houston to the trainer like this? Stressed. Right? So certain things, that's obviously not Houston, but certain things like that. Luckily, the girl that worked with him is back there, and she works for me, and she called me and said, hey, this isn't the same horse we had a week ago. And she said, something's wrong. And she's heard this spiel about ulcers for the past 1.5 years. So we scoped him the next day. And we stuck the scope into his stomach, and he was ate up with ulcers. So instead of going to the trainer, instead of more stress and more ulcers, we were able to take care of him. There's some more of his ulcers right there. So that's him at 1 year old. He's in Fort Worth today at the bloodstock sale as a stud. So he may change the course of the cutting industry. We'll see. So if you look at the stats, 90% of racehorses have ulcers, and 60% of performance horses will have ulcers. And a lot of these numbers came before we knew too much about scoping, and our scopes were shorter, and we got into the stomach and said, oh, there's an ulcer. And we came back out. Now we know more, so I think these numbers would actually be a little bit higher. So if you guys were a stable of racehorses tonight, there's about 100 people here, 10 of you would not have ulcers. The other 90 of you would be sitting there with what feels like heartburn, probably. If you were a quarter horse barn, maybe 40, 30 of you guys would be comfortable. The other 60 feel like you have heartburn. Even though the barbecue is good, you probably wouldn't want to eat it. So we'll talk about Equine Gastric Ulcer Syndrome, which a lot of the terms we use are confusing, and this is no exception, but it's an umbrella term for stomach ulcers. And there's 2 different parts in an equine stomach. There's the squamous part and the glandular part, and they're 2 different diseases. So here's a picture of a horse's stomach that was cut in half. And what's interesting is this top half, the squamous portion, there's a little slice of the esophagus right there. And if you'll look, that's the same type of cells that are in that top half. They're really specialized, thin piece of cells. And our stomach is made up of glandular cells, which is the bottom half of a horse's stomach. Has anybody here had heartburn? I never did till I had 2 daughters. So when we have heartburn, it's acid coming up and splashing into our esophagus. Unfortunately for the horse, one of their poor designs is half of their stomach is taken up by the same cells. So if they have ulcers in this part, it probably feels like heartburn. And the worst night I ever had it, I was sitting up in a chair because I couldn't lay down, eating oyster crackers, thinking about every horse that we ever scoped that had ulcers, and feeling sorry for them and thinking if somebody tied a piece of leather around my chest and cranked it as hard as they could and wanted me to go run, I'd probably kick them or bite them, or worse, if I had my Glock. So I think horses that have ulcers in this portion of their stomach feel like they have heartburn 24/7 most likely. Here's another, just a cartoon depiction of the stomach. You got your squamous epithelium here. There's a really distinct line right there called the margo plicatus. I don't know where that name came from. I did at one point, but it escapes me. And then the bottom part with the glandular, this is where feed goes into the small intestine, that first part of the duodenum. So we grade the ulcers in the top half of the stomach because we know how they happen, we know why we're there, and we can grade them, and it's universal. If I say this horse has grade 4, another veterinarian down the road can say okay and scope them later. The bottom half, we actually describe the location, if they're focal, diffuse, how severe they are, if they're flat, if they're raised, if they're bleeding, if they're secreting fibrin. So we'll show you some pictures here. Everybody see that back there? So here's that top part. This horse is great. You see a nice white intact mucosa. There's no thickening here in the margo plicatus. Everything looks perfect. So here's a horse that has what we call grade 1 ulcers. And the difference is there's no epithelium that's disrupted, but it's thick right here and it's changed colors. And they call that hyperkeratosis. And you can kind of think of that as like a callus you get on your hand. When I see a horse like this, I know that this region's been exposed to acid chronically, and this horse is forming a biological band-aid to try to protect itself from that. And that's the grade 1. Grade 2 jumps into that epithelium actually getting disrupted. It can be pretty superficial. You can have a single one or multifocal. Here's a grade 3, a little bit bigger, more lesions, and there's stomach acid floating down there. Here's another grade 3. You can actually see that one's actually bleeding a little bit. And grade 4 is pretty intense. This particular horse, I don't know how many times they called me. They fed it sweet feed. He would gobble it up, break out into a sweat, lay down and roll, and they bring him to the clinic and we couldn't find anything wrong until we scoped his stomach. And here's another one, same way. You can see that epithelium. And I put this picture in there because this picture we took as that stomach was deflating, and that stomach folds in as it's empty. So you can see these ulcers here are basically where those folds can be exposed to the acid. And ulcers in that part of the stomach come from exposure to acid, which is important to know when we talk about the prevention, which is the biggest reason we're doing this tonight. And when we get into the glandular part, like again, we don't grade them, but we see them here. This is a common place. This little hole right here is where the stomach empties into that small intestine. Right there. Here's another one with some ulcers there. I threw this in because I think those are little pieces of cracked corn in there. And here's another one with a couple little ulcers right there. So anybody got a mare that looks like that, or a gelding that looks like that at feeding time? So to understand the clinical signs, it's important to understand what's going on inside that stomach. So poor appetite is a very important one. Poor body condition can do that. Attitude changes, colic. I think a lot of the colic we treat, ulcers are a precursor precursor to it. The attitude changes, we always ask, you got a grumpy gelding or a moody mare, then ulcers go to kind of the top of the list. Behavioral changes, a surprising amount of horses with ulcers, the only symptom is they won't load into a trailer. And then what do? You beat the crap out of them, stress them out more, and they get in. And oh, that's just how my horse is. He's grumpy, she's moody, If you listen to these horses, whether it's lameness or ulcers, they try to tell you, I think. And as a veterinarian, I'm an advocate for the horse. So if a horse comes to me that I think is hurting, it's up to me to try to figure out why and how to help that. So not trying to make everything about ulcers, but if you go back to the numbers, 90% of the race horses and 60% or more of the performance horses have them. And what's up there? Poor appetite, picky eaters. Anybody got a picky eater? Does your horse like to eat hay first? Okay. So the broccoli and cookies. How many people got broccoli besides David? How many people got cookies and not broccoli? So if you guys are part of a social experiment and you didn't even know it. But if you offer a horse sweet feed or grass hay, and the horse turns his nose up to sweet feed and wants to eat hay, there might be something wrong with that horse. That's like giving a kid cookies and lettuce and the kid wants to eat lettuce. Or adults, except for a few weird ones. David, where do you... He ate like 6 pounds of broccoli. I was hoping he'd colic up here since he skewed our numbers. And another clinical sign is decrease in performance. And another clinical sign, especially in the race horses, decrease in earnings. It's more, how many people show horses here? It's more fun to win, right? It's even better if you win money and win. So what causes these things? Like anything in the horse, it's when an aggressive factor overpowers the defense mechanism, whether it's arthritis, a laceration, etc. What happens to these horses with ulcers when some aggressive factor, whether it's the acid or stress, overpowers the protective part of the stomach. With squamous ulcers, like we said, the squamous is that top half. It's literally the acid getting up there and burning a hole in that stomach. And we, as horse owners, are probably at fault with the domestication of horses. And like David talked about with the Mustangs, horses are supposed to eat all day long. Now, they're not supposed to eat the alfalfa that we fertilize and get fat, but they're supposed to eat a little bit of this poor grass and then walk half a mile and eat a little bit more. So we kind of cause some of these problems, but for horses to perform like we need them to perform, we have to feed them like we have to feed them. And as we talk about the prevention later, we'll touch on that. Now, the glandular ulcers in that bottom half of the stomach, that comes from the same thing. There's an impaired protective layer. That part of the stomach is used to acid, but as we use horses more and we stress them out, that protective layer can go away. So if you've got a racehorse or a performance horse that's running, the blood supply goes away from the GI tract in the stomach and goes to the working muscles like the brain, the lungs, and the heart, which can impair the protective layers of that stomach. And here again, if you can see that, this is upside down, but we're in the small intestine in this scope, and this drip down here, this horse hasn't ate for 14 hours, but it's still pouring bile out. And in this one, you can see it pouring back into the stomach. So even if these horses aren't eating, they're producing stomach acid and they're producing bile acid that's coming back in that stomach and creating a pretty intense environment. Again, the squamous ulcers in that top part come from acid. And as we use horses, that's where the risk really comes up. This graph here, there was a group in Florida in the 90s, Campbell, Thompson, and Merritt, a bunch of smart people that first started studying these horses. They put cannulas in these horses. So they had a tube going directly to their stomach, and they had pH meters. And what they found was this W here is a walk, and there's our stomach acid sitting about a 7 in that top part of the stomach. As soon as they got this horse into a trot, that acid dropped down to a 1 or a 2. And it stayed there through a gallop and a trot until a walk. So if you take your horse out of a walk, the chance of that stomach acid getting up and getting more acidic in that top half goes up. And as we talk about the prevention, I'll bring this slide back up. There's ways we can kind of keep this from happening. So the acid exposure in that top half is what causes ulcers. You can think of it like holding a lighter to your hand. The longer that lighter stays there, the deeper it's going to burn. So the longer that acid is up in that top part of the stomach, the bigger hole it's going to burn, or the more area it's going to burn. The intensive exercise, that causes it. Again, as soon as that horse gets into a trot, you've got the colon coming up and slamming that stomach and splashing acid up into the top. They also put a balloon in the stomach, and that's this the barostatic pressure over here. So as soon as that horse goes into a trot, that pressure goes up, and that's what splashes that acid up to that top half where it's really not supposed to be. And then again, with the intensive exercise, the blood supply is diverted, and some of that protective stuff goes away. The other thing that can cause ulcers is a carbohydrate or a high sugar diet. A few things happen when your horse eats a sweet feed or a high carb diet. I have a 90-pound Labrador who had diarrhea for the past 2 nights, which is why I'm having to use these notes, because I haven't slept. But as soon as I open the feed thing in the morning, he just starts drooling. Your horse's stomach does the same thing. As soon as your horse smells or sees sweet feed, within 15 minutes, the acid production goes way up. And then, if they're eating the sweet feed, they're not chewing as much versus eating hay. So if they're not chewing as much, they're not making as much saliva. And that saliva has bicarb in it, which buffers the acid. So as your horse is eating hay and chewing a lot, they're producing a lot of saliva and they're swallowing it, and it's going down to buffer that acid. The other thing that carbohydrates do, as soon as they hit that stomach, they start to get fermented into volatile fatty acids. And that, again, is more acid. And as soon as the pH drops to 4, some of those cells will start to swell with the volatile fatty acids. And then acid gets in there, it screws up the sodium pumps. The sodium accumulates into the cell, water comes in there because water follows sodium, and those cells swell. And we only see that if there's volatile fatty acids. So that happens as a result of high sugar diets. And that the excess acid that's produced comes up and reaches that part of the stomach that can't handle it. Now, what causes glandular ulcers in the bottom half? So we could probably talk till midnight or so about what causes ulcers in that top half. We could talk till midnight or 1 a.m. about what we don't know about the bottom half. What we do know is that diet does not play a significant role in ulcers in the bottom half of the stomach. You can have ulcers in the bottom half, you can have ulcers in the top half, you can have one and not the other. They live in the same house, but they're not really related to each other. They're kind of like the odd couple, if anybody gets that reference. Exercise can do that, like we talked. The blood supply getting diverted away from that. Stress, I think, definitely plays a role. And NSAIDs, the horses that are on chronic bute, Banamine, will have ulcers down here. It'll burn a hole in their belly. So how do we prevent these things? That's the main thing. But one thing I want to mention before we talk about the prevention is you can't prevent something that's already there. So if your horse already has ulcers, you can do all these preventative measures, and you're not going to prevent it because they're already there. It's kind of like stopping smoking after you got cancer. So 3 factors contribute to these ulcers: increased carbs, not enough roughage, and the exercise amount, which comes down to too much exercise and too often. So I just Googled 3, and I'm not a Michael Jordan fan, but he popped up. So those three factors are what we got to remember when we think about preventing ulcers: the carbs, the roughage, and exercise. So how do we address all three? Feeding modifications. That is one of the biggest things. We want to reduce carbohydrate intake, if we can, to less than 1 gram per kilogram per meal. And most horses are not even getting anywhere near that. That's a lot. So did you say, seen the water boy, right? Everybody's, okay. So sweet feed is not the devil, okay? So we can feed in such a way that we can still feed sweet feed and get the carbohydrates, get the calories and energy that your horse needs to perform like that. And how can we do that? We can optimize the roughage intake. So free choice hay sounds like a good option, right? And it is if your horse eats it. So just because the hay's out there, whether it's a round bale or whatever, doesn't mean your horse is eating it, because how many people actually measure it or weigh it? We don't know. And the type of hay also matters too. Like David talked about earlier, the alfalfa has calcium in it, but any roughage is better than no roughage. And what'd you say, the calcium, 40 minutes? Enough? Right, okay. So 30, 40 minutes till it goes through. But any roughage, that horse is chewing more, making more saliva, more bicarb. And the other thing that roughage does, when it gets into the stomach, it forms a mat of feed that keeps that acid from splashing up into that part of the stomach that can't handle it. So how much hay? The minimum 1% body weight per day is pretty good. And the multiple hay nets, the interesting thing about the multiple hay nets is, again, with the free choice hay, it doesn't mean your horse is eating it. Most horses in a show situation or a barn will quit eating at about 10 o'clock at night. They just quit, whether they got hay there, whether it's on the ground in a hay bag. Well, what they found was if they hung hay in 2 different spots, that horse would go back and forth and eat more during the night, because it's an evolutionary grazing behavior that's kind of hard to take out of these horses. So you could split up your hay in 2 different hay bags, and hopefully your horse would eat it more during the night. So again, back to the saliva production. If you're feeding these horses, the best thing to do is give them forage first. And you can kind of remember that whether you're feeding, whether you're riding, whatever. Forage first, because we get the chewing, which gets the saliva down to the stomach, and it also gives you a mat of feed in there. So if you take that horse out of a walk, there is something to stop that acid from splashing up to that top part of the stomach. And then if you feed him forage before your grain, you've got that extra layer of protection with the feed, and you've got the extra bicarb in there. So when the carbohydrates start hitting that stomach and they produce the extra acid, you've got more of a buffer there. So we'll recommend, if you're riding your horse, feed them 2 to 4 pounds of alfalfa, or any roughage if you can, 30, 40 minutes before you take off. Or in the morning, go through the barn, feed hay first, and then follow with the grain. Because again, that drooling dog effect, as they see and smell that sweet feed, that stomach acid starts cranking out. So again, here's this graph. So the training modifications we can do to try to prevent these ulcers is kind of like the high intensity interval training people do. Now I know in every situation that doesn't work, but how you exercise and when you exercise matter. So when, for instance, if you're cooling your horse down, the long trot, you're still splashing that acid up. If you can walk them a little bit longer, that works better. And how you warm your horse up. If you're doing a whole bunch of trotting before you go, that acid splashing up, and the longer you do it, the longer that lighter's held to your hand, the longer that acid's there, and the deeper hole it's going to burn. And when you exercise matters. From 10 p.m., like I said earlier, to 6, horses don't eat much. It's a natural thing. So the first hours of the morning, that stomach's been empty, is just full of acid. So if you exercise them before you feed them, especially roughage, you got way more acid in there and way more chance of it coming up and burning a hole in that belly. So that's kind of the top half. So how do we prevent ulcers in that bottom half of the stomach, the half that's producing the acid that can handle the acid? So the important thing to know here is what you feed doesn't matter. It's not a disease of the diet. The risk factors we see in that are the exercise level, the amount of time that your horse's blood supply is not going to the intestinal tract, and those protective mechanisms are gone. So 2 to 3 rest days per week is good for a horse that's in training. If you exercise your horse more than 5 days a week, the risk of ulcers in the bottom half of the stomach go up 10 times, which is quite significant. So giving that horse 2 to 3 days off a week really makes a big difference. And the environmental enrichment, they're doing some real interesting studies right now with horses in a herd situation that are blanketed, that can't do the natural grooming behavior versus horses that are. And they're seeing a correlation between horses with ulcers that are blanketed and not because of that environmental, it's enrichment, I guess, for lack of better words. NSAIDs, if you've been to the clinic and we've ever put your horse on NSAIDs, we've probably talked about Equiox, which is way safer for your horse's stomach. But even with Equiox, it's a risk. Prolonged NSAID use can cause these ulcers in that bottom part. And the pharmaceutical prevention, Ulcer Guard is omeprazole, which is like Prilosec for horses. And we also use supplements such as Outlast. We're big believers in Outlast. And there's a couple other supplements like Protect GI that we'll use, especially after we've treated ulcers. So how do we diagnose these things? Basically, gastroscopy is the only way. It's the greatest value. It tells us where the ulcers are and the severity, and that tells us how to treat them. If you've got ulcers in the top half of the stomach, we can decrease that acid for a while with GastroGuard, give the stomach time to heal, and they're fine. If they're in that bottom part, we got to do some more things and add a protectant for that, like sucralfate. I call these waste of time tests, and I've seen colleagues do it. They take their thumb and poke the horse in the ribs and say, oh, he's fine. That doesn't mean anything. There's a stomach block they can do where you put a stomach tube in there and pour a bunch of lidocaine in there. Probably works, but we still don't know where they're at. You can do a response to therapy, which we've done in certain situations where we can't fast the horse. We treat them and see if they get better. We had one yesterday that was sick. We didn't know what was wrong with it. We couldn't find anything wrong with it. Gave it GastroGuard and sucralfate, and an hour and a half later it acted just like her old self and went to eating. So sometimes that helps. We still scoped her to know for sure. Just treat for a month. You can do that, but how many people have treated their horses for ulcers for a month? It's expensive, right? So you're just wasting money. Blood work doesn't work. Blood sucrose works in people. Basically, there's no other way than sticking a scope in that stomach and looking for them. So our treatment, our goals is to get rid of the clinical signs, make your horse feel better so he can perform better and everybody's happy. Promote the healing, prevent complications. This is a guess, but I'd say probably 75% of the late night colics I deal with probably start as stomach ulcers, and the horse quit eating like he should, quit drinking like he should, and now we got a problem farther down the gut that's going to be way more costly at times to treat than preventing ulcers in the first place. And medical therapy, we got to control the gastric acid, we got to protect that bottom layer, the management we talked about, and the protection. The medical therapy we use is GastroGuard. It's the only FDA approved product. It's the only omeprazole that gets through the stomach and gets absorbed. There's compounded ones, but you got to feed. They don't even know how much you got to feed, but in the long run, the GastriGuard actually works, so it's the most cost-effective one. And that's why it's so expensive, is they took so much time figuring out how to get the omeprazole through that acid stomach to the small intestine where it's actually absorbed. So I'll leave you with a couple quotes before we go to some prize giveaways. You can't diagnose what you can't see, and you can't treat what you can't diagnose. So again, that's the importance of sticking that scope in that horse's stomach and actually seeing what's going on. And if he doesn't have ulcers, great, then we know that's not the problem. We can chase something else down. And I'll leave you with this: absent a diagnosis, medicine is poison, surgery is trauma, and alternative therapy is witchcraft. So, and I was in the shower last night, and this came to me. I think the most dangerous thing for a horse is an owner who thinks they know everything. So, thank you guys for coming here and learning tonight.